Thanks so much for having me here. It's quite an honor. And based on the title, you might think I came here today to talk about maybe reasons why there are gender differences in casual sex, but alas, this puzzle has apparently already been solved. It is now a truth acknowledged even by science. Men are, and in the context of the article, biologically predisposed to like casual sex more than women do. So answered, it's biology, as all these articles can attest. We can just go home now. It's interesting that when the media does cover casual sex and gender differences, the possibility there might be sociocultural explanations for these differences is rarely entertained. However, the authors of these articles are indeed correct. Science has had a lot to say about casual sex in the last several decades. So how did this start? Well, in a now famous set of studies by Clark and Hatfield, research assistants approached students in a public area of the whatever college campus they were on, and you can see down in the corner basically what they've asked. They said, "I've seen you around and I find you to be very attractive. Would you go to bed with me tonight?" So this has been turned into e-cards. There was a song with that line in it. There was a whole little person on the street thing where they tried this line on people. This has gotten to be a very famous study, and virtually every intro psych student learns about this study, and then usually is told that it shows how there are biological differences between women and men. Approximately 70% of males responded yes to that offer. Across 3 different time points, what percentage of women do you think responded yes to that offer? No females ever responded yes, not one. Admittedly, they were small studies, 40, 45 people, or women probably each, but still, none. Now, as a result of that big difference, 70% versus 0%, there's been a conclusion that it has to be biological. We can't get sociocultural explanations to explain that away. I, however, have been interested in a particular confound in the Clark and Hatfield study, and that is that men were approaching women, but women were approaching men. And women and men are very different stimuli in our culture. Being approached by a woman is not the same thing as being approached by the man, so we can't assume that those are equivalents. That means that the findings that Clark and Hatfield displayed could be due either to the gender of the participant or to the gender of the proposer, which is something that's been neglected. Now, it just so happens that gender stereotypes in our culture suggest that men would be poorer casual sex partners than women. So, for example, men are stereotyped as being sexually selfish. I'm not going to comment on whether the stereotypes are true or not at this point. I've got a whole other lecture on that. They are perceived to be higher in risk for STDs, and they are perceived as more likely to be violent. And so what I'd like to frame this as is, it's not like it's heterosexual women's fault that they happen to be attracted to a group that is not associated with good outcomes for casual sex, at least in our public imagining of it. So we have to think about then, how could we make it equivalent so that we could actually compare women's and men's responses? So thus far, there's generally been an assertion that women do not like casual sex as much as men. There is a presumption of biological differences, often very vague. When I try to pin people down on, so what exactly is it? They're like, evolution, the brain, you know, I feel like as a culture, we assume this is true, but we don't have any really good specifics on it. And then the explanation for the differences, as a result, are rarely considered. It's just biology, and then we stop thinking about it. So in this talk, I'm going to be addressing the perceptions of casual sex proposers in part 1, and then the perceptions of the acceptors of casual sex in part 2. So starting with part 1. In these studies, I addressed pleasure and sexual strategies theory, which is an evolutionary theory that says that women and men are evolutionarily different, and gendered risk perception theory. I'll go into more depth in those. And we focus on the perceptions of the proposer rather than properties of the acceptor. Basically, the format for this was to have people read a lot of little stories or talk about times when they've been propositioned for casual sex themselves. So why the differences between women and men? I took 3 perspectives to look at that. The first is socialized gender differences in risk perception. Generally, women perceive more risk in just about everything than men do, on average. This includes the risk of getting skin cancer from being in the sun. It includes the risk of STDs. It includes simulated battle situations. Women military personnel ascribe more risk to them than male personnel do. So, in general, women are ascribing more risk. Gustafsson suggests that this is a socialized effect and points out that women and girls seem to receive a lot more precautionary advice than men and boys do. So on the playground, studies have shown that girls are more likely to be told, don't go so high on the swing, be careful, don't get hurt. And then we look at adult women who receive much more precautionary advice, for example, from the police. Be careful, there's a prowler, don't go out at night. So as a result, probably of the socialized effect, women perceive more risk than men do. I totally thought this was going to be exactly the reason why there are gender differences in casual sex, just to mark that. A second theory is put forward by Paul Abramson, who's faculty here at UCLA, and he proposes that basically women and men have the same motivation for sex. They're both trying to maximize their pleasurable outcomes. And that seems all pretty, obvious, I guess, to us, but it's best understood in contrast to sexual strategies theory. So sexual strategies theory has the idea that women are trying to protect their eggs. They don't have very many eggs, so they need to have sex with as few men as possible, and their goal in having sex with men is to be impregnated by a male who will protect them and care for them and their future offspring. Men, by contrast, are trying to spread their seed anywhere they can and impregnate as many women as possible. And this is the sperm is cheap hypothesis, and so women are choosier. This is incredibly popular in the media. This is treated as fact within the media all the time. As a result of these divergent sexual strategies, women are proposed to have been seeking people who have high status, males who have high status, and men seek women who will be faithful to them because they don't want to be cuckolded. They want to make sure that they're taking care of their own child. So the motivation for men is to look for faithfulness and women to look for status. So we'll be testing these 3 theories. So in the current studies, first in study 1A, we examined whether female proposers are perceived differently from male proposers, and participants imagined that they were being propositioned. In study 1B, we replicated the findings of study 1A, except participants read about someone else being propositioned. And then I have a series of really short studies, don't worry, they won't take that long. We examined the likelihood of acceptance of a sexual proposal from familiar people and from same-sex people. And then in study 3, we shifted to ask people about their own experiences having been sexually propositioned. These are from my paper in JPSP. So participants for study 1A, they read this scenario. It's going to sound familiar. A member of the opposite sex approaches you on campus and says, I've been noticing you around campus and I find you to be very attractive. Would you go to bed with me tonight? Just because the question always comes up, the go to bed thing. Some places in the US that's dated, some places it isn't, so we always pilot test. It was fine. This one I think was done when I was at Cal State Northridge, just to give a sense it does have a local connection. And then the participants indicated whether or not they would accept the sexual offer on a 7-point scale. Would they be more or less likely to accept the offer? And then they rated the proposer in terms of variables associated with our theoretical perspectives. So risk, we asked questions about sexual assault, robbery, STDs, and then sexual capabilities was designed to reflect pleasure theory. So would this person be a good lover? Would this person provide me with a positive sexual experience? And then status and faithfulness, which map onto sexual strategies theory. Just for those of you who are interested in the analyses, they're really simple. T-test, which is a method of comparing women versus men to see if they differ. And then we did regressions to predict the likelihood that someone would agree to the sexual proposal. So that's just like a correlation. One goes up, the other goes up. If you score higher on one variable and you have a higher likelihood of saying yes to the offer, that would be a positive correlation. Regression is much the same way. So acceptance of the offer. We do see that men are a lot more likely to accept the offer than women. However, I want you to notice, this is a 7-point scale, and the men are right about 3.7 on that scale. So the men are not saying, oh my gosh, yes, I will say yes to any sexual offer. They're just saying, okay, maybe. And the women are pretty definitively saying, yeah, no. So we take this as a reasonable replication of that original Clark and Hatfield effect for our purposes. So why might they be having these divergent responses to that offer? First, we looked at physical danger. So women perceived that male proposers would be a lot more dangerous than men perceived female proposers would be. This included things like sexual assault and robbery. I have to say that this is a question that's really difficult to get at, however. When we were doing paper and pencil surveys and we had the question about sexual assault, the men occasionally would write things on in the margins like, please rape me. Because for them, the idea of a woman raping them is so ridiculous that it can't even really be fathomed. So they're not really taking the question very seriously. Whereas for women, it is a very serious question. Whether or not they feel it's likely or not, they take it seriously. So I suspect this difference is actually much larger, but we had trouble capturing it with the methods that we used. Then in terms of sexual capabilities, women perceive the male proposers to be not nearly as good in their potential for providing them sexual pleasure as opposed to the men's perceptions of the female proposers. And then just look at, you don't have to look at all of it, I know there are a lot of numbers there. Just look at the two bolded sections there. So what we found was that only one variable out of the theoretical perspectives came out as being an important predictor, so a significant predictor of whether or not someone was likely to accept the offer, and that was the sexual capability scale. So for women and men, it did not interact with gender. Well, for women and men, to the extent that they thought someone was more capable sexually, they were more likely to accept that casual sex offer. But as you saw, there were big differences between women and men in how sexually capable they found their proposer to be. You'll also see that gender is still significant here, so we did not get rid of the effect by thinking about sexual capabilities, but sexual capabilities is an important difference. Now, what was not an important difference, as I said, my favorite variables, I thought it was all going to be about danger and risk. It wasn't at all. That was not an important predictor at all, almost a zero correlation, you can think of that as. STDs was not important. And then also, in terms of the sexual strategies variables, sexual faithfulness and status were not important predictors, and it was not related to gender either. It wasn't an important predictor for anyone in this context. So thinking about study A, just as a review, female proposers were perceived more positively by men than male proposers were by women. Thus far, the results have been most consistent with pleasure theory. And there is a potential confound here as well, in that perhaps men are just more charitable. They say that everyone's a higher sexual capabilities, everyone's lower in danger, so maybe there's just a bias such that men are sort of more charitable. So we contrast that in the next study. So this is a very similar study, but gives you the sense of the layout of the types of studies that we do. In this study, participants read about a man sexually proposing to a woman, or vice versa. And this was an adapted scenario from the one that you just saw from study 1A. And then we saw the same items addressing the proposer's personality traits. Once again, in terms of physical danger, women and men agreed that male proposers are more dangerous than female proposers. There was no interaction with gender, so women and men are in agreement on this. Women and men agreed that female proposers are more sexually capable than male proposers. The guys are not standing up for their own kind here. They're like, yeah, he probably would be bad in bed. And so that's where we're still seeing support of pleasure theory. And we found no support for sexual strategies theory in either of these studies, and I'm just highlighting the findings. So female proposers in both studies were actually rated as higher status than male proposers, but status was not a significant predictor of acceptance for females or for males. And we also saw no support for gendered risk perception. So consistently we find that it doesn't matter how risky you think this person is in terms of sexual assault or STDs, you feel like that's not going to affect your decision. I wonder if that might be operating in some indirect ways, which is something we addressed in the next study. So moving on to study 2. In these sets of studies, and these are a little bit quirky, so bear with me on these. Participants imagine being propositioned by either attractive or unattractive, and we vary that at certain times during these studies, famous people versus unknown targets, same gender targets, and friends. And the goal was to see if there are ever contexts when we can just make the gender differences go away, when suddenly gender doesn't matter. Because as we talk about gender differences, we get narratives of how males will just have sex with anyone. I hear that over and over again. So we wanted to see, is that really true? And is it really true that women are always keeping their needs together and they are just always going to be more conservative than men? So in study 2A and 2B, there were famous targets who were propositioning our participants in our scenarios. And these were determined to be attractive and unattractive via pretesting, a fairly extensive pretesting process where we had people generate names and then another set of people rated how attractive they were to get very equivalent measures of attractiveness across genders. So the attractive targets were Brad Pitt and Johnny Depp for the females, and Angelina Jolie and Jennifer Lopez for the males. I don't think they're too terribly dated yet. It'll be hard to give this in a few years probably. And then for the next set of unattractive targets, you're going to have to believe me, it happened well before the election. Well before the election. So at 2 different time points, Carrot Top and Donald Trump were the least attractive people that our heterosexual participants could come up with. And Roseanne Barr, bless her heart, was the unattractive for males in both of the studies. And incidentally, she came out as being supportive of Trump, so I don't know if that kind of fits together or not. I don't know. And so our goal was then to pit each of these two groups together to see how the attractiveness of the target affects responses to a casual sex offer. Admittedly, this is going to be a little bit out there, but what we did, so this is an example of what we used when I was in St. Louis, I believe. And in that case, I said, you're fortunate enough to spend your entire vacation here in Los Angeles, and believe me, everyone's really behind that. And you're in this cafe, you see Johnny Depp, and he says, would you go to bed with me tonight? We also had a version in Los Angeles where they were studying in a cafe in Malibu, and I always point out to people, like, we're around here, we actually do see celebrities. So, you know, I mean, at least in California, it's not ridiculous that you would see Johnny Depp somewhere, right? I had a research assistant when I was here at UCLA tell a story about how she'd been at a bar with friends, and Leonardo DiCaprio came up and said, I'll take you and you, but not you. He was drunk, apparently. And it seemed to be a very true story, you know, so it's like I'm trying to emphasize that, you know, this is not totally ridiculous, at least for the people who live here. Okay, so a comparison of the unattractive target in study 1, this was between Carrot Top and Roseanne. Women and men did not explain any differences, and they were very unlikely to say yes to this offer. There's a 7-point scale, and they're not even reaching, you know, a 2. So almost everybody is saying no to this offer. It's not true that the males are just saying, yes, I will have sex with anyone. And then you see really beautiful differences when you look at the acceptance of the offer from the attractive target as well. So women and men, no differences in how they responded to this really positive offer. And then Donald Trump versus Roseanne. Again, no one's lining up to accept this casual sex offer, despite all of his status and power. Even at the time the study was done, it wasn't a big appeal. We also got comments in the margin about his hair, it's sort of predictable that would come up. And then in this study, the attractive targets, again, showed no main differences. It looks like a little bit of a difference there, but there was no significant difference between women and men in acceptance of that offer. So again, what we're seeing is that women and men, at the ends of the continuum of attractiveness, are behaving very similarly. We're not seeing that women are always being very conservative in their responses to casual sex offers, nor are men being very indiscriminate. So in the next study, we shifted a little bit, and participants imagined a proposal from their closest non-romantic friend of the opposite sex. This was to try to indirectly get at the idea of safety, because if this is someone you know, and this is also true of the celebrities as well, people tend to feel like they would be safe with celebrities, even though they don't actually know them, they have a perception that they know them, but this gets at that more directly. The proposer had to be someone with whom they'd never been sexually or romantically involved. And a funny story, we also had to say it can be no one you're related to, because in our pilot testing, people were putting down, oh, my brother is my best friend, and then the next screen would be like, oh, would you have sex with this person? So that was really bad, we had to correct that. The perils of doing sexuality research. And so we were comparing women and men, and how likely they would be to respond to an offer from someone they know, a friend that's close to them of the opposite sex. These are all heterosexual participants at this point in the studies. And what we found, I was a little disappointed, because we actually did find a significant difference at this point, such that men were more likely to accept the offer than women. But what was the key factor in predicting how likely people would accept in some of the prior studies? Pleasure. So what I did is I made statistically equivalent women and men and how likely they would be to perceive this person would be pleasurable for them. And once you put that covariate in, the gender difference does go away. So controlling for pleasure, a familiar offer is accepted at the same rate by women and by men. And then in study 2D, we shifted away from the heterosexual dynamic, which I actually do spend the most time studying because it is sort of the hegemonic aspect of sexuality is the heterosexual dynamic, but I'm interested oftentimes in lesbian gay perspectives, especially when I'm interested in gender differences, because lesbians and gay men are women and men too, although I have a hard time getting the reviewers to admit that sometimes. They want to say, oh, that doesn't count because they're lesbians and gay men. So in this study, lesbian gay participants imagined a proposal from a same gender individual. And the question is, would gay men who in terms of attitudes, are more open to casual sex than lesbians are, agree to the offer to a greater extent than lesbians would. Now I want you to think again about what the offer is. You're, by Kirchhoff or something, walking past, and someone comes up to you in the middle of the day as you're on the way to class and says, would you have sex with me? So that's the offer that we're working with. We pose this to lesbians and gay men as well. And what we found is, wow, despite the fact that gay men are portrayed as completely promiscuous and lesbians are the one who want to bring the U-Haul to the second date, there were no gender differences in acceptance of this offer. And I think that shows a couple of things. One is how completely bizarre the offer is, right? And then also, I think for gay men especially, it can show some of the stigma surrounding that. So I think for a gay male, obviously things are improving, but recognizing that if someone comes up to you in an out of context way like that, it could be a sign of danger. So women and men were responding with equal rates of acceptance to this type of casual sex offer. And then in study 2E, we looked at bisexual women, and we actually have studies where I look at men too, but I'm going to focus on this one today. And bisexual women participants imagined a proposal from either a female or a male. And this population allows us to have some measure of a natural control. So generally when we polled bisexual women as a group, they fall right in the middle of the Kinsey scale on average. So on average, this is a group that's attracted about equally to women and men. So that means we can at least partially determine the effects of proposer gender in a way that we really can't with the other groups because it's confounded with the participant gender, the person who's being proposed. Because they're attracted to both women and men, bisexual women then can help us understand if men are a less acceptable stimuli for casual sex than women are. I got in trouble with a reviewer once for saying that bisexual women considered men to be noxious stimuli. They didn't like the term noxious stimuli, so I've had to temper that. I wasn't saying I thought men were noxious stimuli, I was just saying they did, but yeah, they got very upset about that. So I'm saying a less positive option for casual sex. And what we found, again, you see this is a 7-point scale, the means are very low for bisexual women as well, but they were significantly more likely to accept an offer from a woman than from a man. This is something we've replicated a number of times, and we've actually found there are no gender differences between bisexual women and men in rates of acceptance of an offer from a woman. There are only gender differences between bisexual men and women in rates of acceptance of an offer from a man. So this provides more evidence that it's the proposer gender that's driving this effect, not something weird about how women are and how conservative they are regarding casual sex. So across studies 2D and E, for non-heterosexual people, it does appear that males are less appealing casual sex partners. And then we wondered if it would be different when we were having proposals that were made in expected settings rather than these bizarre settings. And so that's what led us to study 3, in which participants responded to questions about a prior casual sex offer that they have experienced. So the overarching question for study 3 is, are predictors similar in both real and imagined encounters? So in study 3, participants recalled prior offer of casual sex, and the items addressing proposers' personality traits from study 1 were included again. So this is all very repetitive at this point. First, this is the percentage of respondents accepting the offer. What percentage of men responded to the offer here? What percentage of men responded to the offer in the original Clark and Hatfield studies? 70%. It's crazy. Like across their 3 studies, and every study we do, it really hovers about 70% of men saying, yes, I would accept this offer. It's really funny. But look what happened to the women when you're talking about someone that you actually know, like someone that you saw in the flesh. This doesn't have to be someone you like, but just someone that you actually saw in person. They went from 0% to 40%. When I say this in my undergraduate sexuality class, I can see all the heterosexual men's eyes light up as they count on their fingers how many women they have to proposition to get at that 40%. Then examining physical danger. Women still were perceiving that the male proposers were more dangerous than men perceived the female proposers to be, but that difference narrowed because now it's someone not theoretical, but an actual person that women and men feel like they can make judgments about. And in terms of sexual capabilities, there's still a big difference between women and men and their perceptions of their respective partners. However, that also narrowed when you're looking at someone in the flesh. So when women imagine a heterosexual offer from a hypothetical person, they imagine someone even worse, I guess, than they do in public. So this is still not great, but it's perceived even more negatively. So once again, don't be scared off by all the numbers. Just look at the bolded parts and I'll talk you through it. First, we see once again the sexual capabilities scale. Just as an aside, we ended up just throwing this in. I don't even remember which research assistant was like, hey, maybe it'd be that. I was like, oh, sure, yeah, we'll put that in, no big deal. It has been this central factor in my research across all these studies. So good to know, and thank you to whoever that research assistant was. I don't remember, unfortunately. And that was, again, the biggest predictor of our predictor variables of how likely people were to accept the offer for both women and men. To the extent that you feel like someone is sexually capable, you are more likely to accept that offer. Interestingly, you see that sexual faithfulness is bolded there. So for both women and men, the more sexually faithful you think your casual sex partner will be, the more likely you are to accept. Did not interact with gender. Both women and men agree that that's an important factor. We did finally see a little glimmer of the idea that risk is affecting these issues. So to the extent that you think someone is more likely to have an STD, you're less likely to accept the offer. And even controlling for these issues, we still see that gender remains significant. So we didn't get rid of the gender difference. So what we find in study 3 is gender differences diminish in real-world contexts, and that sexual capabilities predict the sexual acceptance of the sexual offer. The sexual capabilities is important to both genders, and we found no support for the sexual strategies variables. So thinking about this first set, where we're looking at the proposers of casual sex, again, sexual capabilities is significant across multiple studies. It continues to be very important. And it wasn't just in that last study, but not in any of the studies where we're finding these sexual strategies variables, which are touted in the media as truth, as being predictive of an individual sexual offer. And sexual strategies variables also did not predict pleasure. So sometimes people talk about it being a proximal cause versus a distal cause, but that would suggest that then these sexual strategies variables would predict how pleasurable they think the encounter would be, which would predict how likely to accept the offer. That's not happening. And also, sexual strategies do not predict a desire for a long-term relationship with the proposer, just in case you happen to be working with that paradigm. That's been one of the critiques of this research, is that, oh, well, no, women all obviously accept casual sex offers. Of course, this is a reversal of what was said in '93, but women will totally accept these offers. It's just they would use status as a predictor of accepting a casual sex offer from someone for a long-term proposal of a long-term partner, even though it's a casual sex proposal. We didn't find any evidence for that either. So I've tried to effectively address the critics on this, and we've not found any evidence for the variables that sexual strategies theory proposes. The gender difference, as I said, was not eliminated in any of these studies. And that's one of the reasons why we shifted to looking at the perceptions of the casual sex proposers. So within this segment of the research, I'm going to talk a lot about sexual double standards. Probably all know basically what sexual double standards is, but the idea behind sexual double standards, which goes back to the 60s, is that women are differentially treated for engaging in the same sexual behaviors that men do. So women receive more stigma for engaging in the same sexual behaviors. This for a while was thought to be passé, that no, women are treated equally. And it's like, yeah, I guess if you say a woman versus man is having sex in a college environment now, that might not find a difference, but if you're looking at anything sort of out of the norm, then you still find big sexual double standards. And also, women and men subjectively perceive this too. So they're perceiving that that women are responded to differently than men are. So it's very much sort of alive within the culture. And so in this case, we focus on properties of the acceptor rather than the perceptions of the proposer. So this is the person who accepts the casual sex offer. So in study 1, we examined how people expect to be perceived if they agree to hypothetical casual sex offers, and we identified predictors of the offer acceptance likelihood. So in this case, we can know if you actually accepted the offer. We tried to figure out what made them do that. And then in study 2, we examined how people expect to be perceived if they accepted their most recent casual sex offer. So we looked at both hypothetically and about an actual proposal that had happened to them. And we identified, again, predictors of acceptance of the offer. So in study 1, participants saw a hypothetical casual sex offer. This is very similar to the scenarios that you saw in study 1, or part 1. We asked them whether or not they would accept, and we told them to imagine that they had either accepted or refused the casual sex offer. First, we said, did you accept? And then we said, okay, what would it be like if you accepted? What would it be like if you refused the offer? And then they answered how they expected to be perceived for either agreeing or refusing the sexual offer. And for our purposes, we're just going to focus on the acceptance conditions. It's just the inverse in the refusal conditions. It didn't matter. So we're just going to focus on acceptance. So in study 1, participants indicated how positively overall they would be perceived, how intelligent they would be perceived, and how promiscuous they would be perceived if they agreed to the sexual offer. So we're trying to get at stigma or the sexual double standard associated with casual sex. And then also participants indicated how likely they would be, how likely they'd actually be to accept the offer. And again, we did simple t-tests comparing men's and women's responses and those regressions again. So in general, men expected to be perceived more positively for accepting the casual sex offer than women did. I gotta say, men did not feel like they would be overall perceived as great, perhaps related to some of the stuff we've been talking about earlier in the conference about STD stigma and just a general anti-sex attitude, I would believe. But they did feel a lot more positive about how they perceived than women did. They thought they'd be perceived as more intelligent than women would for accepting the offer. And women believed that they would be perceived as more promiscuous for accepting the offer than men did. So clearly there's more expectation of stigma on women's side than on men's side. In terms of the regression, people who, the more likely you are to feel like you'd be perceived positively, you're more likely you are to accept that that hypothetical sexual offer. If you expect to be perceived positively, you're more likely to accept the offer. There was a gender interaction, and this just showed the effect was stronger for women than it was for men. It was also true for men, though. Independently, it was true that men were more likely to accept the offer to the extent that they thought they'd be perceived more positively. Again, gender was not eliminated here. So men expected to be more positively evaluated evaluated than women did for accepting the offer of casual sex. Anticipated stigma was a significant predictor of the casual sex offer, and it was more predictive for women. Now, study 2, we attempted to replicate these findings using actual remembered casual sex offers, because as I showed in the first set of studies, it sometimes differs. So in study 2, women and men reported on actual casual sex offers. They indicated their answer to the offer and how they thought they would be perceived for that response. The dependent variables are going to be very familiar to you, just the same ones as in study 1. So once again, men who had accepted a casual sex offer expected to be perceived more positively than women did for that choice. They thought they'd be perceived as more intelligent for doing it. And women thought that they'd be perceived as more promiscuous than men did. We see the same pattern, such that the general evaluation scale is the amount of positivity. So to the extent that people are perceiving they'll be, or believe they'll be perceived more positively, they're more likely to accept that casual sex offer. This was again stronger for women than men, but it was true for both genders. So across study 1 and 2, women are less likely to accept a casual sex offer because they recognize that they will be more negatively evaluated if they accept. And I actually used some mediation analyses to further determine that statistically, but I won't go into those here. So that suggests that sexual double standard effects are present in the context of both hypothetical and remembered actual casual sex offers. This hasn't gone away. So I'm going to finish up by talking about some of my ongoing research. And I love to talk about this, so I only talk about maybe, I don't know, 20% of what I've actually done with this. So like, please, like if there's something I've left out, let me know. So the study's in progress. What I want to point out is that when controlling for stigma and pleasure, the gender differences between women and men are always small and sometimes eliminated. Most of the people who do research on gender differences in psychology talk about this. So with gender differences in general, you have a now you see it, now you don't sort of effect. And we really demonstrate that here. Sometimes we don't even have to control for the differences, and then there are no gender differences anyway. Sometimes they're there. We don't really have a control on the effect, so it makes it difficult to publish because I want to make sure I know what's happening. But they're always small, and they're often eliminated. So I'll give you an example of that. So this is a mediation analysis, and you don't have to know any of the statistics behind it, but I'll just walk you through it to give you a sense of what we do. So what we have here is that gender predicts stigma, which we already know, and stigma predicts acceptance of the casual sex offer. We also know that gender predicts your evaluation of the partner's sexual capabilities, and the sexual capabilities predict your acceptance of the casual sex offer. The relationship between gender and casual sex is significant at first, but once you add these two variables, it becomes not significant. So once you effectively control for the amount of stigma that women and men are experiencing, and you control for the anticipation they'll have a good sexual experience, that gender difference goes away in this study. And it sometimes does, sometimes doesn't, so we're working on it. We also find small and inconsistent differences between lesbians and gay men. We have a set of studies right now that are parsing that difference apart, and what we really find, at the point we find that we really get no differences, is when lesbians are approached by lesbians and gay men are approached by gay men, then we really don't see any gender differences in acceptance of casual sex. When we initially found differences, it was because lesbian women don't really have a lot of interest in casual sex offers from bisexual or hetero-flexible women. So if we control for the sexual orientation of the proposer, we consistently are finding no gender differences. The next thing that we're looking at is orgasm anticipation. So going a step more specific than the pleasure anticipation. And what we found in a study that's not directly related but closely related to this set is that for emotional reactions to casual sex, and you've probably heard that, you see this in the media all the time too, women have casual sex in college and then they're like crying in their pillow for the next 3 weeks and miserable. I feel like that's the narrative I see all the time. We find that women do have a little less positive reactions to casual sex than men do in terms of their emotional reactions. But when you control for whether or not they had an orgasm, we've now replicated, that difference goes away. So as long as they've had an orgasm, there's no crying in the pillow. And men who have an orgasm might be crying in the pillow a little bit too. So we're now trying to apply that to acceptance rates for casual sex, not just reactions to or the aftermath associated with having casual sex. So just to conclude, a couple things to think about. One thing is that what I see here, both in how our society thinks about it and also how the scientists in this field think about it, is effectively a fundamental attribution error, and I'll tell you what that is, and more specifically, maybe an ultimate attribution error. So a fundamental attribution error is the idea that we attribute a person's behaviors to the qualities of that person rather than to the social environment. And an ultimate attribution error is that we apply to the group properties of the group as a reason for why they engage in something, rather than the social environment. We see this all the time politically. You know, everyone who studies inequality knows how this goes. And I feel that this is really happening, sure, in how the public perceives it, that's to be expected, but also in how scientists have perceived this research. It's like, well, women are turning this down less than men. It's always framed around what the women are doing, which I've done as well. And hence it must be something about the women. And so I'm really trying to push scientists to think beyond that, and for scientists to recognize their own biases in this regard. And Abramson and Pinkerton, who authored the pleasure theory studies, have made the argument several times that there's not a level playing field for sexuality between women and men. It's not the same set of rules. So you can't compare women and men in just their rates of doing X or Y or Z, because women have so many more constraints on their behavior than men do. And we need to be taking that into account. I don't mean to belabor the point, but I have no evidence to support sexual strategies theory when you're asking people about a specific sexual offer. Sure, if you're asking women how they react to things and men how they react to things, they're more likely to be drawing on stereotypes, and you will get things that are sort of consistent with sexual strategies theory, although open to multiple interpretations. But when we're talking about an individual offer, what did you actually do in this situation, we're not finding evidence for it. So please, when you see those findings in the media, because they're cited all the time, just recognize they aren't actually scientifically proven, because we never even say the word prove, but that there is research that contradicts these findings. And so my take-home message is that women desire casual sex encounters in which they will receive ample sexual pleasure and maintain respect from society, and strangely enough, in that way, they are a lot like men. Thank you.